Well, good day, everybody. As you can see, I've had a little problem with my head, and Danielle asked me this morning if I'd been attacked by a flat earth economist. But in fact, the problem was only the sunshine in Barcelona, and I didn't see what I was walking into. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to come, and thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Danielle, for organizing this very successful conference. So I'll go through this talk quite quickly. A peak oil, a turning point for mankind. And I don't really need to say to this audience that there is such a thing as an oil age, but I think we should always remember that there is a certain time in geological history that's called the oil age. And if once we accept that, we can accept that it's a finite resource, and so production must start, and it must end, and it must pass a peak in between. This is so simple, and yet it's contrary to the normal way we think. So I think it's important to stress this point. And then I just make this comparison between milking a cow. You can milk a cow more or less forever because it has more descendants, and you can go on doing that forever. But draining a barrel is a finite activity, especially a prime vintage of Upper Jurassic oil. That's something special. And as important as the size of the barrel is the size of the tap, that is the flow rate. So I think there's a big difference between draining a finite amount and something that is growing and continuing. I think there's two different kinds of natural resources we should pay attention to. There are minerals, and we heard about them yesterday from Ugo Bardi. They are long-lasting and they are reusable. But energy is different. It is lost on consumption. There's a certain difference between these two types of natural resources. But energy is critical for the modern world. It fuels industry, transport, trade, and modern agriculture. And now turning to energy resources, I think there are also two different types of energy resource. There's the mining of coal, uranium, tar sands, oil shale. The resource is large, but the extraction rate is slow and costly. And it means that more becomes viable if prices rise or costs fall. It is less constrained by the resource itself. It's a matter of concentration. But free-flowing conventional oil and gas is different. There's a polarity about it. It's either there in very profitable abundance or it isn't there at all. So there's two, and there's the economists often, those that don't hit me, often confuse these two situations. One is a matter of concentration, which does react to economic pressures. The other is a kind of polarity that either is there or it's not. And that's amply illustrated by digging up these tar sands. You can see the enormous scale of the work involved with this. And sure, if prices go up, you can buy another digger, I suppose. So let us just reflect a little bit upon the modern world, including here in Barcelona. I've observed cars everywhere. We just live in a world burning up finite petroleum. There's the throb of the engine. Wherever you go, you can hear somebody using petroleum. The cities are just choked with traffic, and much of it is rather unnecessary movement. Overhead, there are aeroplanes. You can see them almost everywhere, the vapor trails. And agriculture, modern agriculture, has been described as a process that turns oil into food. There's a close connection. Then there's the matter of electricity. There are lights on everywhere. There are loudspeakers and television screens everywhere. And in addition, there is the military, who uses up petroleum at quite a rate. So, in short, we have become addicted to cheap energy. So let's ask very briefly how we got to this strange situation that is so anomalous in the longer passage of history. And I think it began about 10,000 years ago when the first farmers appeared. And these were the first species ever who started using external sources of energy. Every other species on the earth and earlier species of man used simply his muscles. But this was the beginning of external energy from animals initially and then slaves and so forth. And also we became the first species ever to trade. And one can imagine the simple exchange in the very early days between perhaps a stone axe and a sheep. This, in a sense, had a certain energy equivalence. And we are the only species who gets involved in this trade. And then the most extraordinary turning point was this question of money. And somebody found a gold nugget in a river somewhere and exchanged it for a sheep. This was no longer energy equivalence. This was a matter of scarcity. This gold stuff had a certain scarcity, and really the quest for gold has prompted enormous power developments and empires. The empire of Spanish Latin America was primarily driven by the quest for gold with which to pay for European wars. And then we've had, as we don't need to tell you this any longer, but we've had financial distortion. The banks have been lending more money than they had on deposit. At first you would say this is impossible, but that is what they've been doing. And they have assumed that tomorrow's expansion was collateral for today's debt. This seems a kind of dubious practice, and in earlier years usury was a sin for the Catholic Church, and I think it still is for the Muslims. But it worked fairly well over the last century or so because oil-based energy allowed the economy to grow. But, and this is a very topical thing to say now, after the peak oil, expansion gives way to contraction, and that means that the debt goes bad. And it seems to me that this day has more or less arrived as we speak. So, this cheap energy that we've become accustomed to over the last century or so gave us what I call the flat earth economic heresy. It's almost a religion, you could say, that the market must deliver, and one resource seamlessly replaces another as the market dictates. And they have this choir that sings in the church every day, "The Stone Age did not end for want of stones." This is what they say. But they have to learn that the oil age will, and there is nothing better taking its place. And this is what one of their high priests said some couple of years ago: minerals are inexhaustible and will never be depleted. A stream of investment creates additions to proved reserves from a very large in-ground inventory. The reserves are constantly being renewed as they are being extracted. This is the view of the economic community. They have not yet changed their position. So let us try to evaluate what the true position is. And I must say it's very much a matter of mindset. I've tried to describe the thinking of the economic community. But I'm a geologist, and we can't do anything except describe. I cannot change the Cretaceous. I'm very different from engineers who say with a screwdriver they can go to the moon, but it's a different mindset. So it's very important to understand the different way people think and react to this situation. So what are the steps in the evaluation? We've already heard quite a lot of this, so I don't need to repeat it. We need to define, first of all, what to measure. There is extreme confusion over the boundary between what is called conventional oil and non-conventional. So the first step is to define very clearly what we're trying to measure. Then, as we all know, the reserve reporting is just a complete confusion and mess, and very unreliable data, including even the industry databases, have become less reliable. And then we need to relate discovery to subsequent production for the simple reason you've got to find it before you can produce it. And the main tools, which Jean has already explained in his talk, is the discovery trend, so-called creaming curve, field size distribution. Jean developed the practice of the parabolic fractal. You can see distribution in sizes, and we must extrapolate production. The so-called logistic curve sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So there are several different tools we can use, and I'll go through these very quickly. First of all, let us address the question of what to measure. And I think it has become useful to define what I call regular conventional oil, and it excludes the heavy oils, the tar sands, the oil shales, all those things. The deep water, one reason for excluding the deep water is we know less about it, and it's a very different economic environment, very different technological environment, so it makes sense to just treat it a little bit differently from what we do know very well. You could say the same about the polar regions. Personally, I don't think the polar regions are very prospective, but they're opening and they're new, so let us treat it separately from what we do know about. Then there's gas liquids from plants. That's another complicated part of the story. And coal bed methane and hydrates and tight gases. There's all kinds of confused references to different forms of gas. But I think that regular conventional, such as defined in this way, has dominated all production to date and will dominate future production. So it's this that matters most when we are dealing with this transition to decline. So the next step is try to decode the extraordinarily confused public numbers about reserves. And I just go through the industry practice of reporting reserves. Well, it started with us geologists, and we were sort of scientific, and we'd try to make the best scientific estimate that we could of the size of a prospect before it was drilled. So we start with a scientific estimate, but in practice, we had to try to get the money from our company to drill this well. So we were in effect competing with each other within the same company to get funds to explore. And these companies were now run by the economists who were looking for the best deal. They'd lost sight of the true geology. They were interested in the economics of the situation. And I worked for a company a few years ago, and it spent about $8 billion drilling in places which had marvelous deals, but very bad geology. So that we became salesmen. We never told the truth. We exaggerated. We did all these things to get the money to drill the hole. And then, if by some luck we did find something, we left the scene, and very serious engineers came onto the scene, now spending very serious, large amounts of money, and it made great sense to start with the most conservative number and then revise it gradually as different phases were committed. And that was good for the engineers, because if it came bigger than they first said, well, that was good for them. So you have a lot of psychology and marketing and salesmanship involved in this evaluation, and unfortunately, all of these confusions enter the public database. But that's what we have to try somehow to unravel all this confusion. I just make an example of the Prudhoe Bay field, the largest in Alaska. And it was found in 1969, I think, and at an early stage, internally, the operating company estimated its size as between 12.5 and 15, but it only reported 9 to the stock market. And it was right to do this, because it was a very remote area. They didn't know what the price of oil would be. There were many economic uncertainties. And so, reporting to the stock exchange, they wanted very firm, strong numbers, so they reported only 9. But they expected it to deliver between 12.5 and 15. And we can see the record here. It's been in decline now for several years, despite all the famous technology you hear so much about, and it looks if it will more or less deliver what it was expected to deliver when people measured the size of the rocks. So this is an illustration. Then we turn to OPEC. The confusion of OPEC is just something unbelievable. But just to summarize it quickly, we can say in 1980, Kuwait reported 65 billion barrels of reserves, and 4 years later, it had fallen to 64. They were producing it. And then suddenly, overnight, in 1985, Kuwait added 50% from 64 to 90. Nothing had changed in the oil fields. Nothing had been found. It was simply in the reporting. And the reason was the prices were rather low, and the OPEC production quota was based on what you reported. So the more you reported, the more you could produce and the more money you made. So this was an anomaly, and then 2 years later it announced a small increase to 92, which perhaps was a valid increase. It could well be a valid increase. But this just exhausted the patience of the other OPEC countries, and Abu Dhabi said, well, hell, if you're 92, so are we, up from 31. And Iran then looked down its nose at Abu Dhabi and said, well, we are better than you, aren't we? 93, up from 49. And Saddam said, we are better than both of you, 100, up from 47. The Saudis had a problem because they couldn't match Kuwait because they were already reporting more. So they had to think for another year or two, and then they announced a large increase. Then from 160 to 258. And then Venezuela, on the other side of the Atlantic, it jumped from 25 to 56, and in its case, it did so by including all of this heavy oil that had not been counted before. So it was a certain validity in that increase, just changing the definition. And the numbers have barely changed since. Look, even today, Abu Dhabi is still reporting 92, despite having produced a lot of oil in between. And I think, and I'm not sure, but I think the higher numbers reflected the total they had found, not what was left, called original reserves. So that may be the explanation. But anyway, there's about 300 billion barrels involved in this false reporting, which appears in most public databases without comment. So it just shows you the extreme level of confusion surrounding this whole subject. Now let's turn on to the discovery record to try to get a more valid data, and I think we've already seen this example of Norway, which is one of the few countries that does produce valid information from the government. And we can see this classic trend. They find the big fields first. It's not difficult to understand why. They're too big to miss. And the trend is flattened out, and you can extrapolate that trend to get an idea of what you think will eventually be found. Then you have the so-called derivative logistic. It's a complicated thing, and I don't begin to understand the mathematics of what it means. But if you plot annual versus cumulative against cumulative, you will sometimes end up with a straight line like this, and you can extrapolate it to get an idea of what the future might be. Again, it points to around 30. Jean has already commented on this. And then we can see the relationship between discovery and production. I think this is very important. This represents the North Sea, namely Denmark, Norway, and the UK. And we see this very classic pattern. The green is the discovery, which peaked in the 1970s, and they're finding smaller and smaller fields. And the peak of discovery, 26 years later, gave the peak of production, shown in red here. So obviously these two things are related, and this is what I'd call a classic pattern, and this 26 years lag is quite a normal, reasonable one. It's interesting to look at Russia. Russia has almost exactly the same discovery pattern despite an extremely different economic and political environment. They also found the big ones first. And I think, except for the confusion related to the fall of the Soviets, they would have already peaked in the 90s and gone down. But following the fall of the Soviets, well, that's interesting. I only discovered the other day that the Soviet policy was to produce the difficult and remote fields in parallel with the easy ones, which made great national economic sense to go in parallel. But following the Soviets, they brought in the capitalists, and the capitalists like to make money quickly, so they just produced the easy ones first. And they had this surge of production, but now they've taken the easy oil and are faced with the more difficult one. So it looks to me like production in Russia is heading on down, following exactly the same pattern we see in so many places. More difficult is the Middle East Gulf, because we've had the OPEC quota constraints and all the political involvement. But my best estimate is that it's about 42% depleted now, and we probably have a plateau for a few years, depending on the politics, and then it starts its final decline in a few years' time. Look at North America, look at the United States briefly, just to give a comparison, and here we have the regular oil, peaked in 1970, as we all know, and then they added the oil from Alaska, and they added the deep water oil, quite important, but the effect, and I think this is typical for the world as a whole, it reduces the decline rate, but it doesn't make much impact on peak itself. Yeah, there's a nice irony about this situation, that this shows Europe's gas, and the better you do the job with all the famous technology we hear so much about, the quicker you deplete what is there. And this is quite nicely illustrated. The Dutch went about things fairly slowly and conservatively with producing a long plateau. That made sense for the Dutch. And Norway, in earlier years, also was very controlled by the government, was very socialistic kind of approach, and it also produced at a slow rate, and it was also constrained by the remote areas and the construction of pipelines to distant places. And then Britain, it started in a similar attitude, very state-run and slow-moving and bureaucratic, but that delivered a sort of plateau. And then the famous Mrs. Thatcher came into government, and she released all the famous attributes of enthusiasm, enterprise, competition, you name it, and it was a highly, highly successful industry. It grew enormously, it created a large amount of new jobs, and it also reduced the price to the consumer, and it was in that sense an extremely successful policy. But the cost was that she got through the country's oil rather quickly, so that within a few years it's all gone. So that just shows the kind of irony that technology speeds up the depletion but doesn't add very much to it. Then if we look at the world as a whole, we see this picture here of peak discovery. I think one of the other speakers have already shown this. Peak discovery was 40 years ago, more or less. It's been falling consistently ever since, despite a worldwide search with all the famous technology, with new geological. I think we can expect it to continue to go down. In 1981, we started using more than we found, and the gap shown in black here, and the gap has widened since. So if we try to put it all together, I get some kind of picture like this, and the green is the regular oil, and I think, as far as I can see, that talking just about the production, not including refinery gains and synthetic oil and other things like that, just the production from the wellhead, I think this stuff already passed its peak in 2005, and I think if you add the deep water and the polar and the gas liquids and so on, you get to about this year. Now, a great debate is going around the world. Is it this year? Is it next year? Is it last year? There's a lot of argument going on about this peak, but I think that misses the point absolutely. We don't know whether it's this year, next year, because, as I've explained, the data is so bad. But what matters is not the date of peak, it is the vision of the long decline that comes into sight on the other side of it. And on that, we can all agree. So I just add, I think I have a few minutes left, to add a few closing remarks. Yeah, you might have seen this picture, some of you, before, but if we drink Murphy's Stout in an Irish pub, it would look something like this. The glass was full in 1900. It's just about empty at the end of this century, and as we speak, it's about half empty. And but I think that few of us would be able to spend 200 years drinking a glass of Murphy's Stout. We try to get through it quicker. So the other pressure. But I think, surprisingly enough, that there is some growing recognition of the reality of this situation, because the political benefits of denying it begin to expire. It becomes less and less feasible for the politicians to say this is not the case. And I think we can look at the changing position of the International Energy Agency as quite an interesting example of this shift of position. In 1998, they produced a report, which you've probably seen, that said that demand outpaces supply by 210, save for the entry of what they called unidentified unconventional. This mysterious stuff was not explained, not mentioned. It was just something that was put in the tables. And in fact, this was a coded message for peak production. And then a journalist decoded this hidden message in their report. And this caused a great problem for the IEA, naturally. All the governments were upset and pressures came and so on and so on. So in their next report, the unidentified unconventional miraculously became conventional non-OPEC. So this was just playing political games. These people, no validity whatsoever well, there is a validity if you manage to decode it. But there seems to be a new position emerging, and I look forward to their next report coming out in November, and they are now giving press releases in which they say, let's leave oil before it leaves us. So I think there's a big shift in the position of the IEA, and I think part of the reason is the member governments, the OECD governments, now like an umbrella so that they can make national policy changes more easily because they're now blessed by a world picture. And even the oil companies begin to change their message. Naturally, they have to sing to the stock market. They can't quite come out and say it. And their actions speak louder than their words. There used to be 7 major oil companies. Now there are only 4. They're selling off their major refineries to some degree. They're selling off lesser marketing chains because they know that the supply is going to reduce in the future, and they buy their own stock on the stock market. And some of it even come out and admit to this. Shell says the days of easy oil are over, and Exxon speaks of the winner's curse. That means when they apply for new concessions, they overbid for it, and they're disappointed with what they end up finding. But I regret to say that BP is still completely denying the situation, and their chief economist the other day came out with the bizarre statement that oil will never peak, never. Exxon put out this advertisement a little while ago, and it's quite a good one, I think. It showed the peak. The top of the mountain is covered in clouds. Absolutely correct. There's a lot of uncertainty about the exact peak, but we can very clearly see the steep decline on the other side. So let's turn to another subject here and just briefly try to put this a little bit more in perspective. At the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago, there were about 300 million people on the planet, and the number only doubled over 17 centuries. Then came coal, followed by oil, and we've seen this enormous explosion of population almost in parallel with oil production. And somebody calculated that today's oil production in energy terms is equal to 22 billion slaves working around the clock. So we have this extraordinary benefit of the way we live today. So the question is, how will we deal when this number of slaves diminishes in the future? And I think there's a huge challenge. Today, 23 billion barrels of regular oil support 6.6 billion people. But by 2050, which is only a couple of generations away, supply is down to 8, which in the present way of living could support only 2.3 billion people. So there's a huge challenge to find out how to use less and to find other energies and somehow adapt to this absolutely fundamental change in history. So it seems to me that this seems to me almost happening. We face a tough transition. I discover that, in fact, there have been several previous Great Depressions. There was a big one in 1870. There's another one in 1930, as we know, and this seems to be the third one. The banks fail and the dollar goes down, and there are food riots and political stress all over the place, and migration pressures grow as things get more difficult. And there may be more resource wars. And I think in all of this, there's a pressing need that people should understand that this is imposed by nature. We're dealing with something imposed by nature. This is not a conspiracy by oil companies. It's not a political gesture by Arabs or OPEC or anything. We're dealing with a natural phenomenon. I think perhaps there's not much time to go on with more of these comments, but there's a growing resource nationalism. Other people have mentioned this. Globalism demands that the resources of any country belong to the highest bidder, but now governments are taking increasing steps to preserve what they have for their own benefit, which makes great sense. Russia seems to be leading the way in that direction. We need an oil depletion protocol, I suggest, which would countries would voluntarily cut their imports to match the decline rate, has all kinds of benefits, would cause the consumers to react, cut their demands, their excesses, to meet some kind of reality. There's a great need to bring in the other fuels, and there are other people who speak about that. There's a lot of opportunity for solar, tide, wave, geothermal and wind energy, and they obviously deserve a lot of priority. Coal and nuclear can help with the transition, but they're also subject to depletion. Biofuels is a problem insofar as it competes with food a little bit, but perhaps there's something can be done there. And then there's even this anaerobic digestion approach whereby you can turn sewage into methane. That sounds promising end point for us to think about. So, the question is, will we be the first? Will Homo sapiens be the first? The geological record is just full of simple species went on forever. More sophisticated species thrived in a certain niche when they found an environment that suited them. But then when the niche closed, they became extinct and the simple ones went on. So the question is, petroleum man is extinct this century. That is a fact. So how will the rest of Homo sapiens get on without him? Probably he never faced a bigger challenge. But this is not a doomsday message. I show this picture. I took it about 60 years ago when I was doing my field work in the west of Ireland. And here was an old man who lived on the farm where I was staying. He had no money. He didn't own anything. He just lived in a room in the back of the farm. But he smiled all day long, and I would suggest he was a great deal happier than anybody working in a modern airport. Thank you. Good luck.